Imagine being hunted across the vast Pacific Ocean by one of the most powerful naval forces the world had ever seen. Warships sliced through the dark water in tight formation while destroyers scanned the endless horizon. Patrol vessels moved with military precision, their crews alert for even the smallest silhouette against the sea. Across the waves, the Imperial Japanese naval network stretched like an iron net, determined to capture or destroy its target. Above the ocean, patrol planes roared through the sky, their engines echoing across the water as radio operators transmitted urgent signals between ships and command posts. Orders moved across radio frequencies demanding capture or destruction, while aerial scouts searched tirelessly below. Every movement in the Pacific was being watched, tracked, and reported as the massive surveillance network tightened its grip. And yet, against all logic, against all odds, a single merchant vessel continued sailing across those dangerous waters. It was not a battleship or a cruiser. Just a humble cargo ship, small against the endless horizon, pushing forward through towering waves and gathering storm clouds. Compared to the enormous fleet searching for it, the vessel looked almost insignificant in the vastness of the Pacific. On the dimly lit bridge of that ship, Filipino sailors studied sea charts and navigation tools under the glow of lantern light. Determined faces leaned over maps as they plotted routes and calculated risk. Their courage and quick thinking turned a simple voyage into a battle of intelligence and deception. This was not a fight with cannons. It was a fight with strategy. Night fell over the Pacific as thick fog rolled across the water. Moving carefully through the mist, the merchant vessel slipped forward while distant destroyers patrolled nearby. Searchlights cut through the darkness, sweeping across waves and fog banks, but somehow the ship remained unseen. Every passing minute felt like a miracle as the crew navigated silently through danger. And then, as the first light of dawn touched the ocean, the lone vessel sailed toward the horizon. The Pacific glowed gold beneath the rising sun as the ship disappeared into the distance. Against impossible odds, a small Filipino merchant vessel had outwitted an empire's navy. In war, victory does not always belong to the biggest guns. It sometimes belongs to the sharpest minds and the bravest hearts. To understand the magnitude of what happened, we must return to the darkest days of World War II in the Pacific. The Imperial Japanese Navy dominated enormous stretches of ocean, enforcing blockades, hunting Allied vessels, and controlling major shipping lanes with ruthless efficiency. Across the vast sea, powerful warships moved in coordinated formations, projecting control over one of the largest battlefields in history. Their dominance was strengthened by an enormous surveillance network. Reconnaissance aircraft scanned the ocean from above, submarines patrolled silently beneath the waves, and warships relayed information through a complex communication system designed to track even the smallest movement across the sea. In these waters, almost nothing escaped the attention of the Japanese fleet. For merchant sailors, every voyage became a gamble with fate. A single sighting could mean torpedoes slicing through the water or bombs falling from the sky. Cargo ships sailing through the Pacific lived under constant tension, knowing that at any moment a routine journey could transform into a deadly encounter with war. Filipino merchant crews faced these dangers daily as they transported supplies, civilians, and sometimes secret cargo between islands and Allied territories. Their ships were not built for battle. They carried no heavy weapons, no armor, and most of the time no escort. The only protection they had was the vast ocean, and the skill and determination of the men who sailed it. Among these vessels was a modest cargo ship crewed almost entirely by Filipino sailors. Many of them had spent their lives navigating the complicated waters of Southeast Asia. They understood the shifting currents, the sharp coral reefs, and the narrow hidden passages between islands that appeared on few official maps. But even that deep knowledge seemed small when facing the immense machinery of the Japanese war fleet. What began as a routine supply voyage soon turned into something far more dangerous. Intelligence reports hinted that Japanese patrol ships were sweeping the region, and aircraft sightings were increasing. The crew sensed the danger long before they saw the enemy. By the time they fully understood what was happening, turning back was no longer possible. Their vessel had already sailed into waters under watch, and somewhere beyond the horizon the Imperial Japanese Navy had begun its hunt. The Filipino captain of the vessel was not a decorated admiral or a famous naval strategist. He was a merchant mariner, a man whose life had been spent guiding cargo ships safely through unpredictable oceans. Years of experience had taught him something many military commanders overlooked. The sea favors those who think quickly and adapt faster than their enemies. When word reached the ship that Japanese patrol forces were closing in on nearby shipping lanes, anxiety spread quickly among the crew. The Imperial Japanese Navy had a reputation for relentless enforcement. Sailors knew that patrol ships often appeared without warning on the horizon, turning ordinary voyages into terrifying confrontations. Those encounters were rarely simple inspections. Japanese naval crews frequently boarded merchant vessels, searching cargo holds and questioning sailors. If anything suspicious was discovered, or even suspected, the consequences could be severe. In some cases, ships that crossed paths with patrol forces were never seen again. Realizing the danger, the captain gathered his officers in the small navigation room. Nautical charts covered the table while lantern light flickered across the walls. The men leaned over maps and instruments, quietly discussing their situation as the ship continued moving through uncertain waters. The choices before them were grim. Turning back could send them directly toward Japanese-controlled territory. Continuing along their planned route would likely lead straight into patrol zone. Even hiding at sea was nearly impossible, because the Pacific's major routes had become heavily monitored corridors during the war. Yet the captain remained calm as he studied the charts. Slowly, he traced routes between distant islands, ocean currents, and narrow reef passages that only experienced sailors truly understood. Then he suggested something bold. Instead of trying to outrun the Japanese patrol network, they would confuse it, altering their route, their identity, and their behavior at sea so that the enemy would believe the ship was something it was not. It was a daring plan built on deception, improvisation, and the hope that the confidence of a powerful navy might become its greatest weakness. The first step in the captain's plan required something bold, turning the merchant ship into a ghost in plain sight. The crew immediately began altering the vessel's appearance using whatever materials they had available on board. Cargo tarps were repositioned, markings were partially covered, and equipment on the deck was rearranged. Slowly, the familiar outline of the ship began to change. Piece by piece, the vessel's silhouette was subtly transformed. From a distance, especially through binoculars or from an aircraft above, the ship would no longer match the profile recorded in Japanese shipping intelligence reports. What had once been an easily recognizable merchant vessel now appeared slightly different, just enough to confuse anyone searching for a specific target. But visual disguise alone would not be enough to evade the Japanese Navy's surveillance network. Patrol aircraft often monitored radio signals to track ships moving through contested waters. Knowing this, the captain ordered strict radio silence except for a few carefully timed transmissions designed to mimic harmless merchant traffic sailing along entirely different routes. The Filipino sailors carried out these orders with remarkable discipline. Every movement on deck was deliberate, and every light at night was carefully shielded to avoid detection across the dark ocean. Even the ship's engines were adjusted so their speed matched the steady rhythm of ordinary commercial vessels rather than a ship desperately trying to escape pursuit. While the crew executed their plan, Japanese reconnaissance aircraft were already sweeping across the region. Pilots scanned the water below while reports moved quickly through the Imperial Navy's command structure. An unidentified merchant vessel had been spotted in restricted waters, and patrol ships were soon dispatched to investigate. Destroyers began scanning the shipping lanes, searching for the mysterious vessel. What the Japanese commanders did not realize was that the ship they were hunting had already begun rewriting the rules of the chase. Instead of fleeing from danger, the Filipino merchant vessel was quietly drifting closer to the very patrol routes designed to capture it. At first glance, sailing closer to enemy patrol routes sounded almost suicidal. But the captain understood a powerful psychological truth about naval warfare. Patrol forces search hardest in the places where they expect enemies to hide. Remote passages, isolated islands, and quiet channels often receive the most scrutiny, while busier waters can sometimes slip beneath a watchful eye. With this in mind, the Filipino merchant vessel quietly moved toward heavily traveled commercial shipping lanes. These routes were filled with ordinary cargo ships carrying supplies across the Pacific. By blending among them whenever possible, the vessel became just another silhouette among many moving steadily across the ocean. Whenever distant ships appeared on the horizon, the crew behaved exactly like an ordinary merchant crew would. They maintained a steady course, kept their speed predictable, and avoided sudden maneuvers that might attract attention. To any distant observer, the vessel looked like nothing more than a routine cargo ship following its normal route. Japanese patrol ships scanning the waters were searching for something very different. They expected to see vessels attempting to flee, ships turning away or changing speed to avoid inspection. Instead, what they observed was an unremarkable merchant vessel moving calmly through the shipping lane, giving them little reason to suspect deception. But the true brilliance of the plan came from timing. The captain carefully studied Japanese patrol schedules gathered from earlier intelligence reports and bits of intercepted radio chatter. Using that information, he adjusted the ship's movements to slip through patrol zones during moments when Japanese ships were transitioning between sectors or temporarily occupied elsewhere. Sometimes this meant drifting slowly through the night for hours to avoid crossing paths with a nearby destroyer. Other times it meant accelerating suddenly to pass through a narrow corridor before reconnaissance aircraft arrived at dawn. The crew grew exhausted from constant vigilance, but they understood the stakes. Every decision carried the weight of survival, and each mile traveled without detection felt nothing short of miraculous. The turning point came when Japanese reconnaissance aircraft finally spotted the vessel. From high above the Pacific, the pilot noticed a small dark shape cutting through the water. Suspicious of the sighting, he immediately reported the discovery over the radio, marking the position of the mysterious merchant ship below. Within hours, activity intensified inside Japanese naval headquarters. Officers gathered around large maps of the Pacific, studying the reported coordinates while radio operators transmitted urgent instructions. Patrol ships were quickly ordered to intercept and investigate the suspicious vessel. But the Filipino captain had anticipated this exact moment. When the crew spotted the distant aircraft circling high above, he calmly ordered a subtle change in course. The adjustment was small, barely noticeable, but it placed the ship along a busy route often used by neutral or civilian merchant vessels traveling between nearby islands. Later, when Japanese patrol ships arrived in the area, they found several merchant vessels moving through the same waters. Cargo ships traveled between islands under the open sky, their silhouettes scattered across the sea. Identifying the exact vessel from the reconnaissance report suddenly became far more difficult than Japanese commanders expected. The Filipino crew then executed another clever maneuver. They allowed themselves to be briefly spotted by a nearby patrol vessel before steering behind a chain of tropical islands. To the Japanese sailors observing through binoculars, it looked like the merchant ship was attempting to escape capture. This reaction triggered exactly the response the captain had predicted. Japanese patrol ships began repositioning to block potential escape routes across the region. Yet every movement played into the captain's design. By anticipating how the Japanese Navy would react, he quietly manipulated their patrol patterns across the ocean, turning their own pursuit into a carefully controlled chase. As Japanese ships repositioned across the Pacific to intercept what they believed was the merchant vessel's escape route, the Filipino ship quietly changed direction. Instead of continuing forward, it doubled back toward a narrow passage between a chain of islands, waters that larger warships usually avoided because of the shallow reefs hidden beneath the surface. The captain knew these waters well. Years earlier, during peaceful trading voyages, he had navigated the same island passages countless times. Nautical charts could only show so much, but they rarely captured the subtle currents and dangerous underwater hazards that experienced sailors learned through years at sea. Now, memory and instinct guided his decisions. As night fell, the crew reduced the ship's speed until the engines barely hummed. Slowly, the vessel crept through the dark channel between reefs and islands. Lanterns were dim, voices were quiet, and every sailor watched the water carefully. A single mistake could tear the hull open against unseen coral formations below. Far behind them, the Japanese fleet continued spreading outward across the Pacific in pursuit. Destroyers scanned wide stretches of open water while reconnaissance aircraft swept across distant shipping lanes. Patrols searched tirelessly, convinced the fleeing merchant vessel would attempt to escape through the most obvious routes. None of them imagined the hunted ship would choose such a dangerous path. The narrow reef passage was considered too treacherous for most naval captains, and it was rarely used by large warships. By the time dawn arrived, the Filipino merchant vessel had already emerged safely on the other side of the island chain, far beyond the search perimeter of the Japanese fleet. But escaping the immediate trap was only the beginning. Inside Japanese naval intelligence offices, officers continued analyzing reports from patrol ships and reconnaissance aircraft. Maps of the Pacific were covered with notes and coordinates as commanders tried to understand how a simple merchant vessel had managed to disappear so quickly. Something about the chase did not make sense. Suspicion spread through the command structure. Japanese naval leaders began to believe the ship might still be somewhere nearby, hiding among the islands or blending into ordinary commercial shipping lanes. Soon, orders were issued to expand the search across a wider area of the Pacific. Destroyers spread across the ocean while reconnaissance aircraft swept the skies above. At the same time, submarines were deployed to monitor key straits and narrow passages between islands. The Imperial Navy tightened its net, determined to find the vessel that had slipped through their initial pursuit. Aboard the Filipino merchant ship, the captain responded by escalating his deception. The crew began creating makeshift signal flags and altering the vessel's markings to resemble a merchant ship from a different nationality, one that Japanese patrol forces would be less likely to suspect at first glance. It was a dangerous gamble. If Japanese patrol crews inspected the ship closely, the disguise might quickly fall apart. But from a distance, or during a hurried inspection, the altered flags and markings might convince observers that the vessel was an entirely different ship already listed in Japanese shipping records. Days passed as the ship continued its unpredictable journey across dangerous Pacific waters. Each sunrise revealed a vast ocean filled with uncertainty, where every new horizon could bring danger. The Filipino merchant vessel pressed forward through contested seas, its crew aware that survival depended on staying unnoticed. Occasionally, reconnaissance aircraft appeared as small shapes on the distant horizon. Whenever this happened, the crew subtly adjusted their course, careful not to make any sudden movements that might reveal they were trying to evade detection. From afar, the ship had to look like nothing more than another ordinary vessel crossing the Pacific. At other times, Japanese destroyers passed within only a few miles. Their dark silhouettes loomed across the water like predators scanning for prey. Sailors aboard the merchant vessel watched quietly as the powerful warships searched the surrounding seas, yet somehow the small cargo ship continued slipping through their patrols unnoticed. The captain relied on a careful balance of patience and boldness. Sometimes the safest decision was to slow the ship and allow enemy vessels to move ahead. Other times he ordered sudden bursts of speed, pushing the engines harder to cross exposed stretches of water before Japanese aircraft patrol schedules rotated back over the area. For the crew, the tension never faded. Their nerves were stretched to the breaking point as they listened to every distant sound across the ocean. In the quiet darkness of the sea, even the faint rumble of an engine in the distance could signal discovery and the end of their daring escape. What made the situation even more remarkable was the cargo hidden deep within the ship's hold. Beneath the wooden decks were crates filled with supplies, equipment, and possibly sensitive materials urgently needed by Allied forces. Packed tightly among ropes, nets, and stacked boxes, the cargo represented far more than ordinary trade goods. It was a lifeline in the middle of a brutal war. These supplies carried enormous strategic importance. Equipment and provisions stored inside the vessel were meant to support Allied operations across the Pacific. If the ship were captured, the cargo would not only strengthen the Japanese war effort but could also expose valuable Allied supply routes operating in the region. The Filipino sailors understood the weight of that responsibility. Standing together on the deck as the ship moved across dangerous waters, they knew they were not simply protecting their own lives. They were guarding the success of a mission that could affect the outcome of battles far beyond the horizon. Each time their ship slipped past Japanese patrols, it felt like a small victory against a much larger force. On one side stood the vast machinery of an empire's navy. On the other was a single merchant vessel relying on intelligence, discipline, and courage to survive. That realization strengthened their resolve with every mile they traveled. As the ship continued across the Pacific beneath rising sunlight, the crew carried on with quiet determination. Every successful evasion felt like defying an empire's war machine with nothing but sharp minds and unbreakable courage. Meanwhile, frustration was growing inside Japanese naval command centers. Officers gathered around large maps of the Pacific as conflicting patrol reports arrived by radio. Some commanders insisted the mysterious merchant vessel had turned north, while others believed it had headed south. A few officers even suggested the ship might have disguised itself or slipped into a convoy. Out on the ocean, Japanese patrol ships scanned the horizon in different directions. Sailors stood on deck with binoculars, pointing toward distant shapes on the water. Each crew believed they might be closest to finding the elusive vessel, yet their sightings and reports rarely matched one another. In response, the Japanese Navy expanded its search grid across hundreds of miles of Pacific Ocean. Destroyers cut through the waves while reconnaissance aircraft swept overhead, turning the sea into a vast battlefield of surveillance and pursuit. Ironically, the larger the search effort became, the more chaotic it grew. Radio traffic flooded communication channels, patrol zones began overlapping, and ships sometimes chased false sightings reported by distant observers. Without realizing it, the Japanese Navy had created confusion within its own network while hunting a single merchant vessel. The Filipino captain exploited the growing confusion brilliantly. Studying his charts carefully, he began steering the vessel along routes that would seem completely illogical to military planners. Instead of choosing the most obvious escape paths, he directed the ship through areas that strategic commanders might dismiss as unlikely. The merchant vessel zigzagged between regions that had already been searched and occasionally entered zones considered far too obvious for a fleeing ship to risk. By moving in these unpredictable patterns, the captain repeatedly slipped through the small gaps created by the shifting patrol routes of the Japanese fleet. At one point, the daring strategy led to an astonishing moment. The Filipino merchant vessel passed within sight of a Japanese patrol group that was actively searching for it. Massive destroyers scanned the surrounding waters, unaware that the very ship they were hunting was quietly moving within their view. Despite the danger, the sailors maintained perfect discipline. They continued their routine tasks calmly on deck, keeping the ship's speed steady and its course predictable, exactly as any ordinary merchant vessel would behave. Because of that composure, the Japanese patrol ships never suspected they were looking directly at their elusive target. Eventually the ship reached waters where Japanese control had begun to weaken and Allied influence was growing stronger. The vast Pacific no longer felt completely hostile. In the distance, friendly aircraft started appearing more frequently in the sky, patrolling the region and signaling that the merchant vessel was finally approaching safer territory. As the ship continued forward, Allied patrol planes circled overhead more regularly. Their presence brought cautious hope to the exhausted crew. After days of tension and deception, the sailors slowly began to realize that the most dangerous phase of their journey might finally be coming to an end. Still, the captain refused to relax his vigilance. Enemy submarines were known to prowl nearby waters, waiting silently beneath the surface for passing ship. One careless maneuver, one moment of overconfidence, could still doom the entire mission before it was complete. Only when the merchant vessel finally sailed into a secure harbor surrounded by friendly forces did the tension begin to lift. As the ship moved safely into port, the crew allowed themselves to believe what had once seemed impossible. They had escaped the massive naval hunt and survived one of the most dangerous journeys of the war. When Allied intelligence officers later reviewed the details of the voyage, they were astonished. In quiet briefing rooms, analysts studied maps, patrol reports, and intercepted communications, trying to understand how a simple merchant vessel had managed to slip through such an enormous naval search. The conclusion was remarkable. A lone cargo ship, small and lightly equipped, had evaded a coordinated hunt conducted by one of the most formidable naval forces in history. Across the vast Pacific, the Japanese fleet had deployed ships and aircraft in large numbers, yet the modest merchant vessel had survived the pursuit. The success had not come from superior weapons or advanced technology. Instead, it was the result of local knowledge, careful deception, and the calm leadership of a captain who understood both the behavior of the ocean and the psychology of the enemy hunting him. In time, the story spread quietly among sailors, officers, and military planners. It became a powerful example whispered in naval circles, a reminder that unconventional thinking and human ingenuity could sometimes outmaneuver even the most overwhelming military force. Today, the story of that Filipino merchant vessel reminds us that history is filled with unsung heroes whose courage unfolds far from the spotlight. Standing on the deck of a simple cargo ship beneath the wide Pacific sky, these sailors faced dangers few people would ever see. Their quiet bravery unfolded far from the headlines of war, yet their actions shaped a story that would endure long after the waves settled. These sailors were not famous generals or decorated admirals. They were ordinary mariners who refused to surrender to impossible odds. Day after day, they worked together against rough seas and relentless danger, relying on determination, discipline, and trust in one another to survive the journey. By trusting their instincts and working as a unified crew, they transformed a vulnerable cargo ship into something far more powerful, a phantom on the ocean. While distant warships searched the horizon, the small merchant vessel slipped through the vast Pacific, evading the grasp of an empire's navy. And that is the remarkable truth of warfare. Sometimes the greatest weapon is not a battleship or a fleet, but the determination and ingenuity of people who refuse to be defeated. If this story amazed you, tell us in the comments where you're watching from around the world. Share your thoughts, like the video, and pass the story along to others who enjoy forgotten war history, because the oceans remember every voyage, and sometimes the quietest ships leave behind the greatest legends.